Namaste, salam, adab, and welcome everyone. It's our great privilege to welcome Dr. Audrey Truschke, if I'm not pronouncing badly, a very well-known professor of history, especially on the topic of South Asian Mughal Empire, modern India and Pakistan history. She was quite much in news in India as well as rest of the world for writing two books, one on Aurangzeb and another, I think in the first book was on Sanskrit, I think Islamic Mughal courts, Persian and Sanskrit speaking world, and second was on Aurangzeb. And the latest one in 2021 is the language of history. I have asked Sunita Vishwanath of Hindus for Human Rights to give a formal introductory remarks. And so welcome, Sunita.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Sunita Vishwanath, a co-founder of a US-based nonprofit organization, Hindus for Human Rights. I'm also co-founder of two other nonprofits, Sadhana, Coalition of Progressive Hindus, and Women for Afghan Women. I've spent my whole adult life working on human rights, and in the past decade, I've been focused on human rights in India, the country where I was born and where my family is. In fact, what I have in common with both Dr. Audrey Truschke, who is the main speaker of today's event, and Rashid Ahmed, who will deliver closing remarks, is that we are all three outspoken advocates for human rights in India and outspoken critics of the Hindu nationalism or Hindutva ideology of the current Indian government and the human rights atrocities taking place in India. We've all been engaged in this advocacy for some time, but now we have a new thing that unites us all. All three of us are named in a defamation lawsuit by the Hindu American Foundation. We are being sued for telling our truth, and this event brings us together to tell more of our truth. For me as a Hindu, for Dr. Truschke as a scholar, and for Rashid Bhai as a Muslim, truth-telling is the only path. And this lawsuit is a scare tactic which has not scared us. And this moment when our communities, our families, and our friends in India are surviving in this nightmare of the second COVID wave and many people not surviving, this is a moment where it's important that we keep up our advocacy for the huge blunder in the direction that India is going in, because at least I maintain that this government is directly responsible for this particular nightmarish situation where so many thousands of people are dying daily. There's also an uptick in violence in this moment, violence towards Muslims, particularly in UP. And so for anybody who agrees with us that what is happening in India is dreadful and the world needs to pay attention, this is an important moment to keep, the world is paying attention because of COVID. So we need to be speaking about the aberration of Hindutva in India. And so with that, it is my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Audrey Truschke, a scholar, an educator, an advocate for human rights, and a new friend. Dr. Audrey Truschke is Associate Professor of South Asian History at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. She is the author of 3 books, Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court in 2016, Aurangzeb in 2017, and most recently, The Language of History, Sanskrit Narratives of Indo-Muslim Rule, and that's from this year. When Audrey isn't writing about the Mughals, Sanskrit texts, or Hindu-Muslim interactions, she is often calling attention to abuses of history and human rights in contemporary South Asia. Her other frequent activities include condemning sexism and Islamophobia, reading, and spending time with her family. So, Dr. Truschke, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And thank you to Razi and everyone who made today's event possible. It's really my pleasure to be with you all. Thanks for taking time out of your morning, evening, afternoon, depending on where you are, to think a little bit with me about South Asia's past and South Asia's present. So I'm going to screen share my PowerPoint. Okay, you all should see my PowerPoint now, and I should be small on your screen somewhere. So I thought I would open with this image. Sometimes it's easier to open with images rather than words. I assume everyone recognizes the individual here. This is Prime Minister Narendra Modi, head of the BJP, India's major political party currently. Now, we all know that Modi likes to take pride in, quote, Hindu aspects of India's past and present, but that's not actually what we see here. Here, Prime Minister Modi is standing in front of Delhi's Red Fort, built by the Mughals, an Indo-Persian or an Indo-Muslim dynasty. For a long time, Delhi's Red Fort was a sturdy, enduring symbol of Mughal sovereignty and the particular kind of world that the Mughals made. Now, some decades ago, that Mughal sovereignty was overlaid with the symbolism of the modern Indian nation state. And indeed, the modern Indian state often holds events in front of the Mughal-built Red Fort, especially on Republic and Independence Days. Indeed, in this image, I believe from Independence Day in 2019, we see a rather public scene. You can see a bit of a crowd in the background. You can see some cameramen hinting at the media coverage. These folks are covering and reporting whatever it was that India's Hindu nationalist prime minister said on this day in front of what was originally a symbol of an Indo-Persian dynasty that he often purports to hate. So how did we wind up here? How did we wind up with a man who built his political career in large part on massacring Muslims in Gujarat in 2002, standing in front of a testament to state dominance in a particular kind of pre-modern culture built by a Muslim-led dynasty? I'll tell you one thing, we seem to end up here a lot. Here's another image from the next year, just last year, 2002. You see Uttar Pradesh's chief minister, Yogi Adityanath, standing with then US President Donald Trump. So happy to put that in the past tense. Holding a picture of Trump with his wife Melania at the Mughal-built Taj Mahal. As many of you will know, Adityanath's government has underfunded and under-advertised the Taj Mahal for years. Hindu nationalists like Adityanath have even gone so far as to deny it is indeed a structure built by a Muslim-led dynasty. And this is all part of a larger agenda of undermining any perceived sort of, quote, positive contributions of Muslims to Indian culture and heritage. But here, we don't see that, do we? It holds up a framed image of this gorgeous structure, arguably the single most recognizable symbol of India, past and present, in the eyes of most of the world. There's some interesting identity building going on here at the nexus of politics, culture, and religion. And what I really want you all to notice is that in both cases, in both images here, we have a building, Delhi's Red Fort and Agra's Taj Mahal, that each has respectively layers of meaning, both modern and pre-modern. Now, one layer may be invoked more than the others at any given point in time, but they're all there if you sort of look and think deep enough. What I want to do with you all today, I want to take this idea of layered meanings and explore it through 3 examples that are drawn from different aspects of my research. All right, and I do have to warn you all, I am generally speaking more of a textual scholar and a cultural historian rather than someone who works with architecture and images. All right, so we move away from the image world here. The 3 examples that I want to go over today are Sanskrit, Aurangzeb, and Indo-Persian rule. Okay, and these are three examples that are not necessarily connected to one another, but they are all things that I have worked and published on. My goal is to offer some comments on each topic specifically, but moreover, what I want to do is offer insight into how meaning making has worked for specific communities in the Indian past, and arguably to a greater degree in today's talk in the Indian present. I also seek to explain, and Sunita covered a bit of this in her opening remarks, some of the Hindu rights anxiety and pushback against scholars, such as myself. This has become extreme in recent years, and vis-a-vis me, it appears to be currently accelerating. And I want to explain why that is, why I am perceived as so threatening. Now, I warn you all in the talk, there's a little bit of weaving around, but that's okay. In fact, I hope it's virtuous. I hope that it helps you see a little bit about how I sort of toggle between different kinds of politics in the past and the present, right? Because I am primarily as a scholar interested in the past, but of course I'm grounded in the present, right? So I do go back and forth a lot. At the end of the talk, I will return to these two images and see if I might say something a little bit more about them. But for now, let me start with Sanskrit. Sanskrit, Samskrita, you can say it different ways. What is it? What is Sanskrit? Now that may sound like a really basic question, but it's actually not as straightforward as you might think. So let me answer this first as a modern scholar. For modern scholars, Sanskrit is a language, of course, primarily a pre-modern language, but it's also a literary tradition. Okay, there's a lot of stuff written in pre-modern Sanskrit, and we often use Sanskrit to refer to that sort of totality of text and traditions. Sanskrit has some ties with Hinduism for scholars. It's sometimes called Devavani, the language of the gods in that regard. But the Hinduism-Sanskrit connection is not exclusive. Okay, there's a lot of stuff written in pre-modern Sanskrit that has nothing to do with Hinduism. Last thing I'll say about Sanskrit for scholars is that it certainly has politics, pre-modern politics. All right, let me give you just two very brief examples. In pre-modernity, Sanskrit was the language of kingship for many Indian kings, okay, Hindu and non-Hindu. Second is that for many pre-modern Sanskrit intellectuals, Sanskrit literary tradition had both in theory and to some degree in practice, it was based on caste-based exclusion. Okay, you were supposed to be of a particular social class and gender, right? Typically a man, in order to know Sanskrit. So that's for scholars. But most people aren't scholars, are they? All right. For many modern people, especially non-scholars, Sanskrit is something else entirely. All right, and let me answer the what is Sanskrit question for sort of two groups. First, Sanskrit is sort of affective in religious context for many Hindus, right? So you go into a temple, you go into a mandir, and you maybe hear a Brahmin priest reciting Sanskrit verses. Maybe you understand snippets, maybe you don't, but it marks that space as sacred in a particular way. That sort of religious-based affective view of Sanskrit that typically is not in conflict with scholarly views thereof, and it's different, but there's usually no perceived conflict there. But there's a second group of modern people who have more of a problem with scholarly views of Sanskrit. Okay, and this is the Hindu right or Hindu nationalists, and this is a politically defined group, a pretty narrow politically defined group. For them, for the Hindu nationalists, they view Sanskrit as a kind of potential cultural glue. Okay, it's something that as a symbol might be able to bind modern Hindu Indians together. So this view of Sanskrit, for them, this is a very politicized in a modern sense view of Sanskrit. And as part of this, the Hindu right often takes a very combative stance against scholars, such as myself. Okay, so they perceive a conflict. Let me tell you a little bit more about Sanskrit as cultural glue, and then I'll tell you about the conflict. So as cultural glue, okay, this goes back to V.D. Savarkar, the godfather of Hindu nationalism or Hindutva, this political ideology. Sanskrit was a very powerful symbol for Savarkar, specifically of an ethno-nationalist state defined by Hindu supremacy, which did not exist in Savarkar's lifetime, but that he wanted to bring into existence. Now, this was not a religious thing for Savarkar. The man was an atheist. He didn't believe in any god or gods. All right. Rather, for him, he thought that Sanskrit could embody cultural and ethnic superiority. Now, part of why I'm talking about this is not just an idea in the sky. This is an idea with legs and power, especially today. Here we see Prime Minister Modi, again, this time venerating an image of Savarkar. This sort of, this push towards Hindutva, right, and making Hindutva more and more the sort of a key driving force in modern day India. This is what has driven in recent years modern India's push to sort of teach Sanskrit. And I do put teach in sort of scare quotes there, okay? The modern Indian state has poured significant financial and cultural resources into trying to get primary and secondary school children to learn Sanskrit. Now, the one interesting thing about this is that almost none of them, if any of them, appear to be able to read pre-modern Sanskrit text, even after years of Sanskrit study. And indeed, that's not the point. The point is not to give modern day Indians access to the vast array of Sanskrit literature and philosophy and history written in Sanskrit. Rather, the idea is to give them access to Sanskrit as this modern cultural symbol. So Hindutva Sanskrit, as I'm calling it here, not only does it lack interest in pre-modern Sanskrit literary culture, but is threatened by it. Okay, and this is where we get to, as I think of it sometimes, the sort of mantra of Hindutva Sanskrit, which is love Sanskrit, hate Sanskritists. Let me tell you a little bit about how this plays out. So India has millions of Sanskrit manuscripts. Okay, Sanskrit manuscripts these are handwritten copies of Sanskrit text written in pre-modernity, so through sometime in the 19th century, let's say. India has never centralized its archives, so these manuscripts exist in thousands of archives across the entirety of India. And there have been some efforts, some pretty significant, serious efforts to preserve these manuscripts, right? And you can see images here of sort of kind of low-tech preservation, right? Wrapping them nicely in cloth, putting them in glass cabinets, keeping them in boxes. This is all good preservation practice. There have also been serious attempts to digitize manuscripts, millions of Sanskrit manuscripts. And yet, when Sanskritists like me, people who actually read the language and want to work with these manuscripts, show up at archives, we get told no a lot, right? Sometimes we can't even see manuscripts. Very often, we are not allowed to photograph them. I have been denied repeatedly access to even digitized versions of manuscripts. And so there's a push to preserve them, but not to actually allow people to read them, all right? In fact, there's even modern right-wing pushback against certain kinds of people learning Sanskrit in the first place. And the most poignant example of this probably came in late 2019, when Feroz Khan was appointed as assistant professor of Sanskrit literature at Banaras Hindu University. Now, a bunch of students at BHU, sort of right-leaning politically, they objected. They said, we do not want a Muslim teaching Sanskrit. Now, note in that objection, there was no attack on Professor Khan's scholarship, on the quality of his work, which is arguably the only thing that matters, right, for a professor. Rather, the attack was entirely identity-based. In this, and I should say the end of this story, okay, Professor Khan was denied his appointment. Okay, so the protest was successful in this regard. And we see here some of the sort of terrible consequences, I think, of Hindutva or Hindu nationalism in the present day, which is the supplanting of Indian Muslims, seen here in an employment situation, but you all know that it gets far worse and far darker than this. Speaking of Hindutva, let me say something about that term. Okay, I like talking about terminology. It's what we would call neo-Sanskrit or phony Sanskrit, fake Sanskrit. All right. So Hindutva, it's supposed to look like Sanskrit. That's sort of the goal. And thus, the design, as I see it, is to lend Hindu nationalism a sense of age and gravitas that it simply lacks. But this is an illusion, right? Even in the term itself. So the Hindutva has two components, Hindu and Tva. Hindu is not a Sanskrit word, as some of you may know. It's a Persian term. It was coined about 1,000 years ago. Okay, and for the vast majority of the last 1,000 years, it has been used by Persian speakers to describe residents of the subcontinent. So a specific religious connotation is a bit later, and Hindus using the word widely, self-referentially, is even later still. Now the word Tva, the part Tva of the term, at least that's real Sanskrit, okay, unlike Hindu. Tva means N-E-S-S, ness, as a suffix. So Hindutva is Hindu-ness or Indian-ness, in a sense. The term was coined about 100 years ago. So it's not very old. And embedded in it, as I see it, is the sort of ahistorical and anti-intellectual bent of this ideology regarding Sanskrit specifically. But of course, most people don't know that. Right? Most people, just sort of accept Hindutva, it's a word, and don't think about where it comes from until scholars like me show up and start dredging up details of history. Right? Scholars are so pesky and insidious, aren't we? And so there, perhaps I think we see a little bit more of where that second part of the mantra, as I see it, comes from. Love Sanskrit, but hate Sanskritists. Now, speaking of hate, there's a lot of things in pre-modern Indian history that folks don't like so much, that they actually viscerally dislike and hate. And let me now turn to one of those, my sort of second topic today, which is Aurangzeb Alamgir. Now, Aurangzeb Alamgir, he was the 6th ruler of the Mughal Empire. He's been dead, by the way, for a really long time, for over 300 years. If you sort of missed that and didn't realize that, you could almost be forgiven, really, because to hear how modern day people talk about and excoriate Aurangzeb, he seems to be super alive today. And in fact, as I see it, there are 2 Aurangzebs. There is the modern day myth, who is a cartoon villain, often literally seen in cartoon form here. And then there's the historical king, okay, the guy that's been in his grave for over 3 centuries. I'm going to tell you about both briefly, okay, and then sort of go through contrasting them with a specific example. Let me start with the modern guy, since we're in modernity. So you can see some vignettes on the screen here. Many of you will recall when Aurangzeb Road was renamed in 2015 in Delhi. Okay, so Aurangzeb Road is gone as a name, and the road is still there. And the road is now called APJ Abdul Kalam Road. And that's important. Okay, it's named after India's 11th president, and as many people saw it, a more acceptable kind of Indian Muslim than Aurangzeb. And as I read it, that's what the renaming was truly about. It was about a Hindu majority state claiming and exercising the right to adjudicate who is and who is not an acceptable Indian Muslim. Now, why is modern day Aurangzeb so terrible we can't even handle having a road named after him? Well, it has a lot to do, and this is sort of the middle part of this slide, with fictions about his widespread state-led persecutions of Hindus. Okay, and these are largely fabricated. Now, I want to be clear that the Mughal state was a pre-modern state, and Aurangzeb was an absolutely ruthless emperor. Okay, he enacted plenty of violence, a horrific amount of violence, truly, just not religiously focused. Okay, that's more of our problem, less of his problem. But the modern day Aurangzeb is imagined as such a religious bigot, as such a terrible guy, that to be like him is like the worst insult in the world. And you can see this in the headline here. Being like Aurangzeb is an insult thrown around by both the left and the right. You can even see an image here, again, of Prime Minister Modi. I keep returning to him. all right? He's dressed up to look like Aurangzeb. Now, personally, I gotta say, I really think that this level of beard, this is better than like the Santa Claus beard he's rocking these days. Okay, but that's just a personal opinion. That's neither here nor there. All right, I'm showing you this image because it's supposed to be highly insulting to Prime Minister Modi. Right, to be dressed up like Aurangzeb is a terrible, terrible thing. Now, if we imagine Aurangzeb in this modern cartoon character kind of way, I mean, he's so terrible, who would even want to know about him? And indeed, this is what many Hindu nationalist governments on the state level in India have thought. And they have tried to erase Aurangzeb from the history books in various parts of modern day India. Now, this move, it's premised on misinformation and hate and just a misunderstanding of the reasons why we teach history at all. But of course, it also prevents us from seeing the real historical Aurangzeb, all right? Because this is not the real historical Aurangzeb. This is our modern day imagination and projection of him. So let me tell you just a little bit about real Aurangzeb, the guy who actually lived and ruled parts of northern, central, and southern India in the last half of the 17th century. He was a pre-modern king. He was not all that exceptional, honestly. Most of what he did was in line with prior Mughal rulers. The main way in which Aurangzeb Alamgir was exceptional was in terms of military conquests. Specifically, he was able to conquer the Deccan through bloody wars. This is something that the Mughals had thirsted after since his great-grandfather Akbar's time. But what Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan had been unable to achieve militarily, Aurangzeb was. Two other things I'll mention about Aurangzeb. One is that the number of Hindus, the percentage of Hindus in the imperial nobility increased during his reign. That's not because Aurangzeb was pro-Hindu. This was not like, some, Hindu reservation system or anything like that. Okay, this was a practical strategy. He was a practical emperor. It had to do with the integration of Maratha-led lands in the south. Last, but certainly not least, Aurangzeb believed, like all prior Mughal rulers, in severe punishment for those who went against Mughal state interests. Okay, the man was not a teddy bear. You did not want to get on the wrong side of this pre-modern emperor. Now, these two Aurangzebs, the modern myth and the historical king, they swirl together in our minds today. And often the modern myth prevents us from seeing the historical man. Okay, and that's a point that I make rather forcefully. I think I try to make it forcefully anyways in my Aurangzeb book, where my goal is to get back at the historical king. But today I thought I might do something just a little different. I thought that I might just contrast them, so you can sort of see the modern politics versus the pre-modern politics. And I figured if I was going to pick one example on which to contrast modern and historical Aurangzebs, I might as well go big. So I'm going to talk about the Kashi Vishwanath temple. Now, the Kanchi Vishwanath temple, this was a temple in Benares. Okay, it's destroyed now. It was destroyed on Aurangzeb's orders. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And you can actually see part of the temple wall. So I guess like one wall wasn't destroyed. Okay, it's in the photo here. It is incorporated into the Gyan Vapi Masjid, a mosque, which currently sits on this site. Now, who exactly built this mosque? I'm unclear about that. Most people assume Aurangzeb had it built. I was never able to verify that either way. Whereas I'm a little fuzzy on the mosque, like the when and the who kind of parts of that, right, and building that. I'm not unclear about the temple destruction. That I'm very clear on, okay? So let me tell you the historical story and the politics in Aurangzeb's day, and then I'll circle back to the modern politics. Now, to understand why Aurangzeb ordered the Kashi Vishwanath temple destroyed, all right, you have to understand a couple of things. One, there was no separation of religion and politics in his day. Okay, this is very different than now. Now we have a different understanding of the separation of religion and state in the US versus India. Okay, so there's variety today, but we all have like some basic, we're like on a spectrum, let's say. Aurangzeb was not on this spectrum, he was off this spectrum. So that's one. Two, Aurangzeb, like Hindu and Muslim kings before him, he considered temples to fall within state agency. All right, so that's a sort of controversial, that would be highly controversial today, right? When states try to exert control over religious places of worship, not controversial in Aurangzeb's time. And the last thing you need to know is this, that Aurangzeb actually had two basic policies regarding temples, and they go together. The default was protection, and the exception was destruction. All right. Now, in both cases, the Mughal state is exerting power and authority over temples, okay, which was normal. Aurangzeb didn't invent that, he just inherited that. All right. And the idea was that the Mughal state would protect temples so long as everything was fine. But if associates of a particular temple were perceived to act against Mughal state interest and perceived by Aurangzeb, right, he's the emperor, so it's his opinion that matters in this regard, then that temple became a legitimate target of state destruction. Now, I just want to note that this is very difficult for many modern people to grasp, because this is an almost complete inversion of how most modern people sort of think about religious places of worship. For us today, for a state to destroy a masjid or a mandir or a church, that's like the worst thing we can imagine. All right, I'm not arguing with that. I'm a modern person too. I hold that value too. But we have to hold that back long enough to try to understand a very different ordering in Mughal time. Now, as I said, protection was the norm. Most Indian temples still stood at the end of Aurangzeb's reign. And there are a number of farmans from Aurangzeb's period where he says, we're going to protect temples. Some are specific, but some are broad. And this is an example of a broad one. This is from early in his reign, 1659, a year after he comes to the throne, right? Less than a year. This is early 1659. So he says, several people have, out of spite and rancor, harassed the Hindu residents of Benares and nearby places. So no, we're talking about like all of Benares and like nearby, including Brahmins who are running temples. You are the Mughal state officials to whom the farman is addressed. You must see that no one unlawfully disturbs the Brahmins or other Hindus of that region, right, of this whole area, so that they might remain in their traditional place and pray for the continuance of the empire, the Mughal Empire, of course. Note particularly the sweeping nature of this. There were a lot of temples in Benares in the 17th century, just like there are a lot of temples in Benares now, and this includes nearby places. It's unclear to me exactly what that includes, all right? But you know, we're talking about dozens, possibly hundreds of temples. We only see that sort of vagueness when it comes to temple protection orders. For temple destruction, it is always much more specific and pointed. Aurangzeb, by the way, ordered roughly a dozen temples destroyed in the course of his reign. Okay, most historians count just under a dozen. So if you thought it was thousands, it's not, right? About a dozen confirmed temple destructions. And the one I'm going to tell you about is the most famous today, the Kanchi Vishwanath. So the temple was destroyed on Aurangzeb's orders, except for the wall, this one wall, in 1669. And there were a couple of issues. There were two connections that I've outlined on the slide here of folks associated with the temple being connected to Shivaji, the Maratha warlord's escape from Aurangzeb's court in 1666. Aurangzeb was very unhappy about that escape, and sort of understandably so. Okay, Shivaji was a huge pain in Aurangzeb's neck for the rest of his life, for the rest of Shivaji's life. He died in 1680. Additionally, Benares landlords who were affiliated with the Kashi Vishwanath temple rebelled against the Mughal state in 1669. Remember what I said about getting on the wrong side of Aurangzeb Alamgir? Right? This did not end well for these folks. Okay, their temple was brought down. Now, as I said, and I want to just emphasize this aspect of pre-modern politics before I talk about the modern, that we have to explain the temple protection and destruction policies of Aurangzeb together. And you should ask why. Why do we have to explain them together? Well, because they go together and historians can't cherry pick. Right? We can't just talk about the destructions. We can't just talk about the protections. Okay, we have to try, as part of the historian's mission, to understand them in tandem. And in fact, that helps us understand overall the kind of pre-modern politics at play. Now, this is all interesting and hot and heavy politics so far as the Mughals were concerned, right? But the Mughals are long, long gone. And what we're left with are modern day politics of the Kashi Vishwanath temple. And in modern times, many people, not all of course, but many people see this temple destruction, not as a fact of ancient history to be understood in its own time, that's how I see it, but as something to sort of be avenged 300 years too late. There's now a movement to sort of bring back the temple, which would of course involve destroying the mosque that currently sits there. Now, there are a couple of sort of obvious problems with this idea, this politics of grievance. One is like, we're avenging this against whom? Like I said, the Mughals are long gone, right? The Mughal Empire was wiped from the face of the earth, what, 7 generations ago at this point? Even the entire Mughal world is gone. We've had like a couple of historical breaks since then, colonialism and then modern independent South Asia. A second issue is selectivity. Mosques were destroyed in pre-modern India, less frequently than temples were, and for different reasons, and that has to do with a very different set of relationships between politics and mosques and identity versus temples and politics and identity. Okay, but mosques were destroyed, and we never hear about that as politics of grievance today, so that selectivity is very telling. And last, and I think most damning, is that our values have changed. Religious places, as I mentioned, they used to be legitimate targets of state action in a violent, bloody pre-modern world, but that was in the past, right? I use the past tense, they used to be. Now we have, I would like to think, better ideas in this regard. I think that the Hindu right, the Hindu nationalists who are advocating for the destruction of this mosque, they know this. They know that they have no argument in modern times, right, to justify this. And I think that's why we get to this headline, which is from last month. The ASI has ordered diggings, or sorry, that a court has ordered the ASI, the Archaeological Survey of India, to sort of start digging right by the former site of the Kashi Vishwanath temple. And my question on this is really, what are we digging for? The facts here are not in dispute. Okay, and this is very different than, say, the Babri Masjid destruction in that situation. In the case of Ayodhya's Babri Masjid, which you all know about, there was no evidence for a temple destruction in pre-modernity. Okay, all the evidence points to that idea being a fabrication of the colonial period. Here in Benares, this is a very different situation. Here, there definitely was a temple that was destroyed on Aurangzeb's orders. All scholars agree on this, as far as I know. I've never heard a scholar dispute this. So the Hindu right isn't digging for evidence. They don't need that. They're digging for what they can never find. Namely, a modern day justification for destroying a place of religious worship so as to privilege one group, Hindus, over members of all other Indian religions. So that's a lot of modern politics, right? Let me do a little bit more in modern politics, and I'll give you a little bit more in pre-modernity. So this is sort of turning to my third example, which is Indo-Persian rule or Indo-Muslim rule. Okay, roughly the late 12th to the early to mid 18th centuries. The end date, especially, very fuzzy there. We won't get into that. And so I just want to start off right off the bat with this, with modern day politics and how it's imagined today. Okay, Indo-Persian or Indo-Muslim rule is overarchingly remembered in popular memory as an era of horrors and oppression and darkness and rule by the sword and all of this stuff. Now, beyond Hindu nationalists, many other modern day Indians and people from the region of South Asia overall would not go nearly that far. But I think that there is a lot of negativity, a lot of negative views of this period in general. Where does this come from? I think this is one question that one can, in my opinion, always should ask about modern day politics. Like, where did this idea come from? That Indo-Persian rule was this like terrible or at least highly problematic period. It doesn't come from the period of Indo-Persian rule by and large. So it comes later. let me give you two storylines. Okay, for scholars, answers are usually come in multiples. It is what it is. Here's one storyline. Okay, and this one comes from the British colonial era. So you all know the basic outlines here. Okay, the British roll into town, really get going in like the early to mid 18th century. 1757 is when we typically start the colonial period with company rule. British colonial rule continues for about 200 years. And it was pretty awful in many regards, right? I mean, there were executions without trials. There was all kinds of oppression. British colonialism was an openly exploitative enterprise, and it was an openly racist enterprise, right? And you see that in the British officer relaxing idea, sort of photo here, right? British colonialism was built on racial superiority and an argument for that. So from the British perspective, there was this question, like, how are they going to justify this, right? They want a minority of Britishers to rule over a much larger diverse population of Indians and like take all of their wealth out of India and like send it to Britain. This is what I would call a tough hand. This is difficult. This is a tough sell job. Okay. Now the British were really good at this. They were really good at selling terrible things in this period. And so they came up with many arguments. Right? To quote a very famous scholar, there were multiple ideologies of the British Raj. One of them was this, which it was to say, okay, and they were speaking to themselves, their audience back in Britain, and to Indians. Okay, so they're speaking to multiple audiences. Many British colonial thinkers said, hey, at least we're better than the dudes who came before. Right? At least we're better than the other guys. And when you look before British colonialism, it was Indo-Persian rule before them. Okay, and the Mughals were the sort of biggest example, right? But as many of you know, there were a number of other Indo-Persian dynasties as well. So the British tried to make Indo-Persian rule look terrible and look horrible so that they would look better by comparison. They advanced that agenda through numerous ways and numerous venues, including through scholarship. All right. Scholarship does not always lack politics, right? It's a point to which I'll return in a very different context later. So the best example, one great example of this, is Eliot and Dowson's The History of India by Its Own Historians. It's an 8-volume set of works, and it gives excerpts translated largely from Persian medium histories of people who wrote during and about Indo-Muslim rule. Right? So it's primary sources, it's the gold standard for history, and it's in their own words. Like, how could you argue with it? That was the thought. Now, as it turns out, Eliot and Dowson were very selective in what they chose to translate, and they also translated in particular ways to make Indo-Persian rule look far more terrible than those who wrote about it intended it to look at the time. All right. And they didn't really hide why they did this. And these are quotes from the introduction to volume 1, that openly extols the supremacy of the British government, that would be the British colonial government in India, versus, quote, Mohammedan kingdoms of India sunk in sloth and debauchery and emulating the vices of a Caligula. Right? You don't want to be like Caligula. That's a very bad comparison. Now, this is one idea, right? This is one sort of source that this idea that Indo-Persian rule is this kind of period of darkness and horrors come from. So, keep it in mind the next time that you hear, Prime Minister Modi talk about, 1200 years of slavery or something like that. He's really repeating British colonial propaganda, right? Man could decolonize a little. But anyways, here's another place that this comes from, which is from Indo-Persian texts, okay? And this is the primary archive that historians even today use to reconstruct the broad period of Indo-Persian rule. And one issue that we have with these sources is that certain values have flipped in a sense, okay? So one we sort of covered already, which has to do with temple destructions. And in fact, for some writers, in pre-modern Persian medium writers in India, some of them viewed temple destructions as very virtuous and good. Like some of them even said it happened when it didn't happen, okay? That tells us about values and ideas in pre-modernity, but doesn't actually tell us about real history. Another thing, another example I'll give you very briefly, has to do with jihad or religious warfare. Okay. Many writers deployed that in pre-modern Persian text as a virtuous thing, as a good thing. So they would claim that certain kings were doing jihad when they weren't. They were just like conquering more territory and other, kingly activities. But for them, that was good. For us today, of course, to do violent jihad or something like that, that's a bad thing. So our values have changed. But one thing that this means is that those who argue in bad faith or are just have a certain level of ignorance about the nature of pre-modern Indo-Persian materials are liable to misread these texts, right? You're just reading through it, maybe in an English translation, right? You don't know the context. You might very well misunderstand what's going on. Because we can't take historical sources at face value, right? That's just not only true of Indo-Persian texts, that's true of all texts. They have to be read as documents in their own time, right? Not as documents written in our times, which they are not. Now, one approach to dealing with this is what I just did, which is to contextualize it, right? And to sort of explain this is what people said in the past and this is why, and we have to understand it in that context. But here's another approach, which is just to read a different archive. Okay, and this is what I do in the language of history, my most recent book. I argue that we should read Sanskrit text as opposed to only reading Persian text to understand Indo-Persian rule. Hold on, is this chat from me? Oh no, that's somebody else. All right, so what happens when we do that? I'm going to give you just one very brief example, and then I promise I will close and take questions and that sort of thing. Okay. And this is an example of a Sanskrit text from Kashmir, okay, an area of interest to many people today for very different political reasons. All right. And I'm going to tell you today about 15th century Kashmiri politics. Okay. And this is a Sanskrit text written for a Muslim dynasty, the Shah Miri dynasty, by a man called Jonaraja. So he has the first part of the text is about pre-Shah Miri history. Then he goes into the Shah Miris. Okay, so this is like the beginning of like Muslim-led rule in Kashmir. And this is his opening line. Now, this is very like typical Sanskrit. You always have a sort of opening line praising whatever relevant deities or deity, can be singular or plural, that's relevant to your topic. And look at who Jonaraja praises going into Shah Miri rule. The self, Shiva, Vishnu, Brahma, Buddha, Jina, or karma, action itself. So we have a variety of Hindu deities. We have the Gautama Buddha, we have Jains, Jina represented, but we have absolutely nothing Muslim, right? This is interesting. And in fact, Jonaraja continues this throughout his text, throughout his treatment and discussion of the Shah Miris. We tend to talk about them today as the beginning of Muslim-led rule in Kashmir. But for Jonaraja, well, they're not like super Muslim, all right? And in fact, he focuses specifically on Zain al-Abidin, who was a 15th century king. And he says King Zain, he felt immense sorrow that the region had been oppressed by Malecha rulers. Malecha is one of the most common Sanskrit terms for Muslim. So here, it can also just mean barbarian. So here, there were some kind of barbarian rulers, possibly Muslims, but Zain al-Abidin, who I would describe as a Muslim today, was not part of them. I talk about some crazy pre-modern politics going on. And in fact, King Zain al-Abidin, he's likened to being like Vishnu, who rescued the earth when it was oppressed by demons. And in fact, when you read the text overall, Jonaraja describes the Shah Miris essentially as Hindu kings. He says that they're descended from Shiva. Okay, he names their ancestors as Arjuna and Babruvahana, right? Like not exactly like Muslim names, right? He says that Zain al-Abidin listened to Sanskrit text and that the man was friendly to Brahmins. And here is where we get to sort of what Jonaraja cared about. Right, and you see, sort of going into this text, my question is, well, what did he think about Muslim kings? That's why I read Jonaraja's Raja Tarangini, the River of Kings. That's the name of this text. Okay, but that's not what Jonaraja cared about at all. For him, the Shah Miris were like any other Kashmiri sort of pseudo-Hindu kings, I guess. Okay, but what he really cared about, his politics, that was Brahmin supremacy. All right, Jonaraja is obsessed basically with Brahmanical privilege throughout his text. That's what he wants to preserve and defend. And he likes Zainal Abidin for a whole series of reasons, much of which concerns being friendly to Brahmins, right? That he gives Brahmins jobs and that he punishes people who hurt Brahmins, and that he establishes mattas and then this sort of thing, right? He feeds Brahmin mendicants, so on and so forth. Now, Brahmanical supremacy is hardly an issue that has been left in the past, but it looks very different now. Okay, and one way that it looks different is that when we look at the past, slightly over 500 years ago, looking back at Jonaraja, it's hard for me to see if people were opposed to Brahmanical supremacy. You would think some people would be opposed, maybe they were, but I don't really have intense records of that from Jonaraja's period. Right? There are sporadic records here and there, but the views of lower classes that might be opposed, for example, they just don't tend to get recorded nearly as often in history. Whereas today we can see far more pushback, right? This is a modern picture, obviously. Okay, some of you may remember it from several years back. This is Jack, the CEO of Twitter, holding a sign, standing with various anti-caste activists. And the sign says, "Smash Brahmanical patriarchy." Now, Jack, our Twitter CEO here, paid a very heavy price for this image, right? He got a lot of hate for it and still does, right? He's under pressure again in India for slightly different reasons today. Here's another difference in terms of caste politics, past and present. Jonaraja, 500 years ago, he didn't try to hide his interest in Brahmanical privilege. Okay, he screamed it from the rafters. For him, defending inequality was a virtuous good thing. That was his value set. Whereas today, there are many people that defend Brahmanical supremacy and superiority and privilege, but I would say many of them try to hide it a little bit more, right? Because they recognize the sort of clash of that with modern day values. Speaking of hiding things that are in plain sight, that's a good point to sort of transition back to the two images with which I began my talk, and sort of ask what might all of this then, what might we take out of this to comment more here. So maybe one thing to say is just this, that when I look at images like this, at least I very clearly see a series of modern politics at play. And I see a tension between the Hindu nationalist narrative of the Indian state, right, and that sort of narrative that it should be a Hindu nationalist state, versus the reality that the Indian state has multiple cultural origins and influences over time. But what of the pre-modern politics? I mean, we're looking at images in part of Delhi's Red Fort and Agra's Taj Mahal, and both of those buildings have pretty intense, deep layered pre-modern politics that I didn't discuss with you today. But my guess is that most of you know less about them. Maybe you can name which king built the Taj Mahal and for whom and how many children she had before dying in childbirth. Kudos if you remember the number, okay? But there's broader context there, and we don't know as much about it. In fact, those details of history tend to be lost and even subliminated when modern day politicians try to redefine symbols and try to fabricate the past rather than appreciate its intricacies. The antidote to that is pretty clear. It's knowledge and nuance, right? That's what scholars can provide. And in fact, I would argue that one of the superpowers of academics, if we get to have superpowers, one of them is this. It's our depth and our attention to detail. We see points of tension and we can ideally draw out multiple histories, key threads, and implications. In my experience, most people, not all, but most people will tolerate that when scholars talk about politics of the past. All right. But when scholars start to get into real trouble is when we become political ourselves. Many modern people think that scholars ought to just leave alone entirely the politics of the present, right? That we just shouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Because if we do, the argument goes, we will be somehow compromised, we'll be somehow biased. It's somehow inappropriate for scholars to be political today. But I think that that's wrong. In fact, I think that there's a really virtuous way for scholars to be political. And for me, that way is to advance our values of knowledge and free inquiry. Okay, and academics should be free to pursue our areas of research, past and present, free of oppression, free of restrictions, and free of intimidation. That's what academic freedom is. And it's something that's been in somewhat short supply recently for me and for a whole lot of other academics who work on the region of South Asia, especially scholars based in India. This is my politics of the present. This is a politics where many people wish me to be silent. And in response, I choose to use my platform to promote knowledge and critical thought. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was quite revealing and very interesting, and perhaps we all learned a lot. And I think now I'm inviting Rashid Ahmed Saab for concluding remarks before we go to question and answer. So Rashid Saab, welcome.
Thank you, Razi Bhai and others who organized this wonderful event. I was wondering, since I am not a scholar or historian, how I would follow Audrey, such a relevant and prolific historian and writer, but she made my job very easy. The case she has for me made is that history and politics are not two separate entities. History is just the manifestation of politics, it seems like. So whatever the politics going on in whatever era or contemporary, just few years later or a decade later, it becomes history. So from that perspective, I thank my co-defendant along with Sunita, and we also have another two co-defendants. I should not leave them unmentioned, because we have been kind of in a way put into a same platform, that is Raju Raj Gopal of Hindus for Human Rights and John Prabhudas of Fiacona. But as I said, I didn't know what to say. I was just trying to figure out how I would follow, but this is what I could think of. The concluding remarks could be, is that the Hindu nationalism that has brought India today where it is, literally for thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, to the death or deathbed, is not limited to India. And in many ways, or at least in a considerable way, this rise of Hindu nationalism in India has many supporters, contributors right here in our country, in our neighborhoods. And as Indians, from a perspective of Indian, as an Indian American, more and more I realize when I speak with non-Indians, irrespective of their faith background, they just simply cannot distinguish. There are some, but as a general rule, they simply cannot distinguish between Gandhi and Gandhi's killer. To them, they are Indians. I know right here in my city, there are people on Gandhi Jayanti, they will go garland Gandhi's statue, And you can later on see on their Facebook celebrating Gandhi's killer's birthday. This only Indians can distinguish and understand. Non-Indians just cannot. So what this means is, since we are living in a country that does not understand this Hindu nationalism, which is just another ethno-nationalism, so we need to more and more perhaps speak in terms of ethno-nationalism. This is Hindu ethno-nationalism because Americans can relate to it better. But not only we speak of it, but we need, not only need, I think it's a responsibility of Indian Americans living here to caution rest of the Americans about the presence of this ethno-nationalism, the growth of this ethno-nationalism or Hindu nationalism, and their collaboration with existing deep-rooted other ethno-nationalists. For example, white nationalism. You may all know that Steve Bannon's politics, you all know, he was appointed as the co-chair of Hindu Republican Coalition. And these Hindu nationalists hang out with likes of Newt Gingrich, Frank Gaffney, and they have it appears that they have a good working relationship with people like Daniel Pipes of Middle East Forum. All these politics, Americans don't understand. To them, these Hindu nationalists are just another Indians. And to them, the India is a country of diversity, yoga, Bollywood, nonviolence. That image is still there. So for them, it is difficult to distinguish between Gandhi and Gandhi's killers. So my humble request that we all need to start raising awareness of all Americans of people who are in influential offices or media, because if we don't do it, I don't think anybody else can do it because they don't understand. And I just want to end with a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. History will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashid Bhai. Thank you very much for an inspiring and revealing concluding remarks. Before we go to a half an hour question and answer session, I just want to show you our upcoming Saturday, as is the custom, upcoming Saturday event, which is going to be a literary event on Urdu ghazal rendition. Basically, it's a mahfil sher-o sakhan, and with a little bit experimentation, we are going to have a little talk, and at the end we will have a rendition also, but in between there will be a very established 7 poets from India who will be reciting their poetry. So please join us coming Saturday at the same time with the same Zoom link.